Good morning, everybody. Welcome to church, and just so glad to be able to share the word with you again. It was exciting to see everybody last week, and I just hope that you all are doing well, and I hope that this finds you well. We are going to be continuing to look through the book of Hebrews today. Specifically, if you would like to follow along, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. However, before we get into that, I just want you to think with me for a second. I kind of want you to remember a time when you really needed rest. Now, whenever I try to think of times like that, I think of like soccer season when I was in high school. I think for like the first week or two after the season was over, I would sleep basically all day, every day that I got a chance, or Saturdays during the season. If I wasn't going to a debate or forensics tournament, I would probably sleep most of the day as well. But that's just a time where I can think of where I remember needing rest. Another example that I kind of think of is in the summer of 2016, I worked at a camp in Iowa in the small town called Eldora. And the biggest thing that this place is known for is that part of the movie Twister was filmed there. And we happened to be there on, I think, the 20th anniversary of the movie releasing. And so they were showing it for like a week at the local theater that only had one movie at a time. And I just think it was really cool. It was a really fun experience, but I don't know if any of you have done this before, but working at camp is a very exhausting experience. To be fair, most of you have lived a lot more life than I have, and you've done a lot of things that are more exhausting than a week at camp, or than a couple months at camp, to be honest. And you've lived your adult lives, and you've done things that have left you feeling drained. You know the feeling that I'm going for here. You know the feeling that we're kind of talking about, where you just need to rest. And I remember at the end of that summer of working at camp, that's how I felt. But the day that we got home from camp, my family and I were leaving to go on vacation in Alabama, and I'm pretty sure that I just spent the whole first day there in bed. I don't think I did much else. I don't really think I had a desire to do much else at that point, but that's just one of those things where when you need rest, you kind of seek to find it. And I would argue, just as we're talking about this, that like rest is a good thing. It can be really easy to look at it and say, oh no, it's lazy, or oh no, that's a waste of time. I could be doing so much more productive stuff. I could be working, I could be trying to clean, I could be doing all these other things, and sometimes we need to do those things. But I don't think that it's a really biblical perspective to say that rest is a bad thing, or that rest is inherently sinful. And I think that sometimes we do that because rest is something that God actually intended for us to do. It's something that he's called his people into for the entirety that they've existed. In fact, the whole reason in the Ten Commandments that Sabbath was set up was because A, humans are not created to constantly work. We're going to break down if we do that. And B, because where the rest of the world is going to keep working, God wanted his people to take a day and cease. And we don't really do that anymore, but we're going to kind of get into that in a little bit. But the thing is, rest is a promise that God gives to the people who are faithful to do what he has commanded them to do, and that he gives to those who are faithful to the call he gives them. And we're going to hear that a little bit today in the book of Hebrews. And I don't necessarily just mean in a physical sense, but in Christ we find a spiritual rest. We find a rest for our souls as well. And that's hopefully what we're going to take from the text today. So if you would like to follow along, again, Hebrews chapter 4, and for now we're just going to look at the first two verses. It says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us just as they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." Now, what he's talking about here, last week, we talked about how the author is concluding his message by saying that the Israelites in the wilderness heard the good news and the promises that God had for them, but because of their disbelief, they weren't able to enter into that rest. Because of their disbelief, they ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. That was what happened to them. Because they didn't believe the good news that God had given them, they didn't get to enter it because the news meant nothing to them. And I mean, the author does kind of go on to explain later in the passage we're in today that they didn't even rest when they did enter the promised land, as you can see in verses 3 through 8. He goes on to say, "Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his works. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day." And basically what the author of Hebrews is saying is he's explaining that the Israelites entered the promised land. They had their kings, they had their judges, they had their rulers, they had all the things, but they did not enter into that rest. And the rest that was promised then is still promised today, and the day is yet to come where it is complete. And that's kind of what he's talking about, is like the promise has been fulfilled in part, but not in whole, and we still wait for the day to be fulfilled in whole. Do not falter while you wait. It's ultimately kind of what the author is getting at. And then he goes on to explain in the first two verses again that their disbelief in the promises made the good news worthless to them. I mean, think about that for a second. If you do not believe a message given to you, then the message has no worth to you. I think that's true. For example, when I was in the sixth grade, we went to this back-to-school block party, and you had to call in advance to put your name in a raffle to win a couple things, and I didn't do it. Okay, I didn't, I don't know, I guess I was lazy. I didn't work at it, I didn't put any effort into that, but I didn't know that my mom had done it beforehand. And so while I was there, we were just playing games. I was talking to some of my friends, and one of them came over to me and said, "Gage, they just called your name for a Wii." Now, when I was going into sixth grade, this was when the Wii had just come out, and it was all over TV, and it was all anybody was talking about. We thought it was so cool, and it was really neat. And it would have been really easy for me to just be like, "You're just messing with me. You're just kidding, you're making a joke. I know my name's not in there because I didn't do anything to put my name in there." It would have been really easy to disbelieve the news that my friend had given me, but I chose to believe them. And when I walked up there and they said, "Are you Gage Addington?" I was like, "Yeah." They handed me a Wii. And like, how cool is that? But that message that they had given me, if I did not believe in it, would have no value. If I didn't believe my friend who was telling me the good news, then I wouldn't have gotten the Wii. Much in the same way, if we don't have faith in the good news that we receive, the good news of Jesus Christ, then we don't receive the gift of the good news. If we're disobedient, then what is the gain? If we lack faith, if we are disobedient people, then have we truly heard the good news, or do we truly believe it? And I'm not saying that we're going to be completely perfect from the day we hear about Jesus to the day that we die. That's not what I'm saying. I think there's a big difference between somebody who struggles with sin and somebody who has a disobedient heart. Somebody who lacks faith. I think there's a big difference between the two, and I would say that if we have a disobedient heart, if we have no faith, then the good news has no worth to us. And I think it's really important to notice here that the good news that we have received has much more weight and much more importance than the good news that the Israelites received when they were being brought out of Egypt. Sure, they were being brought out of captivity. They were being brought out of slavery. They were being brought to the land that had been promised to their ancestors. They were being given all these cool things. God saved them from Pharaoh and his armies. He brought them across the Red Sea on dry land. He had them in the wilderness, and he was showing his presence with them daily. And that is so stinking cool. But they didn't believe. And so they wandered in the wilderness until they died. That generation wasn't able to enter into the rest promised to them because they didn't believe, because they didn't have faith, because they were disobedient to the God who saved them. They had nowhere else to go. Nothing else they could have done. And the message that we've heard, it's much greater than just some land. It's much greater than just some nation that we get to have be our people. No, this is so much greater than that, because the message we have received is freedom not from earthly captors, but freedom from the captor of sin and death itself, that we are no longer bound to the things that hold us in fear and in pain and in torment. We are free. But if we do not believe, if we do not have faith, if we have disobedient hearts, then that message means nothing to us. And if the people who didn't believe that God had brought them out of Egypt, if the people who did not have faith then, who had disobedient hearts then, were left to wander in the wilderness until they died, what do we reap when we are disobedient and when we have no faith in the one who saves us from death itself? It is a much greater call that we've been given, and therefore I think that the options we have are a lot heavier than they were for the Israelites. See, the Israelites had received a message of the rest to come when they entered the land promised to them. They were given a new home, a new nation. We have been given the good news of Jesus Christ, freedom not just from the rulers of this earth, but from sin and death and everything that comes with them. When they were living in disbelief, they didn't get to enter the land promised, but the weight of disbelief is much greater now in the face of the good news that we have been entrusted. However, the promise is the same. When we are faithful, when we believe the good news of Jesus Christ, we are given the opportunity to enter into God's rest, which is where the author goes next, and this is how the passage continues in verses 9 through 11. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. This is where we're going to conclude the passage today, and this is kind of where I want to land the plane, is with this idea of this rest that we get to enter. You know, at Ozark, there was something that some of the professors would say, and it was kind of along these lines, and it was that sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is take a nap. And I believe that sometimes rest is worship, because we're taking what God did in the beginning, we're taking what He did in creation. He rested from the work He had done, and we are following suit. Now, I'm not going to say And I love doing this. Don't hear me wrong. I'm not going to say that sitting down and watching our favorite sport or playing our favorite video game or watching a dramatic movie or something like that, I'm not going to call that rest. I actually think that those things can be restful, but I also think that they can keep us from rest. I don't know about you, but I get really into my sports, really into my video games, really into my movies and my books. And if I'm really engrossed in it, that's not a time of rest for me. That is a time where my emotions are going every which way and where I'm passionate and where my energy is kind of being sapped. And so that's not necessarily what I'm calling rest. I don't think that sitting down and binging a TV show for 10 hours in a day is resting. I don't think that would match up with what the biblical idea of Sabbath rest is. But I believe that when we truly take time to just cease, to stop working, to slow down, and to enjoy what God has given us, and to rest in Him, to rest in His promises, and to rest in what He has given us, that is when we truly experience Sabbath. You know, I think it's easy for us to look at the Ten Commandments and to say, dude, those are so important. Yes, don't murder. Don't be don't covet what your neighbor has. Don't commit adultery. Don't have greed. Don't do these things. Don't have a God that you worship other than the Lord our God. Don't make images to worship and all these other things. It's really easy to look at these and to say, hey, those are important. But how often in churches do people commend those who practice the Sabbath? How often do we say, oh my gosh, you've broken the commandment of keeping the Sabbath holy? I've never heard anyone say that. I would argue that it's the commandment that we overlook the most, and I think that God made it not necessarily because we needed to be legalistic about it. We could talk about how Jesus says that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But the second we hear that, so often we think, oh, rest was made for my benefit. I wasn't made to rest, so therefore I'm not going to take the time to have Sabbath rest. That's what we do, because time is money. Time is the most valuable thing we have. And so therefore, we're going to spend it all doing the things we want to do. We're going to spend it all doing things that make our lives better. We're going to spend it all doing things that need to be done. And like I say, there are times where that's what you have to do. But if you don't take time for Sabbath rest, you're eventually going to wear out. You're going to be broken down. And where will you turn in those moments? You know, I think that there are two ways that we need to view this rest. And I'm going to just kind of skip over what we just talked about, the whole Sabbath thing. But there are two ways that I want us to view the rest that God gives us for a moment. The first is in an earthly sense. God offers us rest in the here and now. Not only in that He commands us to take a Sabbath, a day where we set aside and we just cease to work and we just rest in Him. And I think that's awesome. And I would call that just a routine practice of resting in the Lord and what He's given us. But He's also given us the opportunity to rest in Him. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." You see, Jesus gives us rest for our souls when we come to Him. That doesn't mean that things are always going to be easy, but that does mean that He will be with us and that the burden will be lessened. Come to Jesus, all you who just worked a 70-hour week. Come to Jesus, all you who are raising 5 kids and don't know where your wit's end is. Come to Jesus, all you who are struggling with family and friends and loss and love and pain and everything that comes with life. Come to Jesus and He will give your soul rest. The other way that I think we ought to see this is in a heavenly sense, because God offers us eternal rest in Him. In Revelation chapter 21, part of John's vision is described in this way: "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people, and God Himself will be with them and be their God." He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And this is where I want to land the plane today, because here's the thing. God has not given us some empty promise or some false hope. He has given us himself in his Son, Jesus. That he didn't see it fit that we should remain in our death, but that he would take it away by becoming temporarily subject to it. We have eternal rest in him. And in the meantime, we're called to believe and to be faithful to what he's given us. And so I just want, as we're winding down, I kind of want to leave you with this thought. You know, that feeling of relief when you've just finished a lot of work, or when you've just finished a big project, or when you've just gotten done traveling or practicing or doing something, and you finally get to let down for a little bit. I want you to picture that, but forever. That is just one of the many gifts that God has promised to his people. He promises to give us rest now and into eternity. Now, I don't really know what that looks like for each of us today, and I don't necessarily know what that looks like for you in your life, but I know that what Jesus has to offer is better than what you're fighting. What Jesus has to offer is better than what you're fighting for. What Jesus has to offer is eternal and now. And so all that he asks us to do is to wait and to be obedient with the faithful hearts he's given us until the day he returns. Would you pray with me? Father, you are good. Thank you for another opportunity to dive into your word and to see what you have for us. God, just please give us rest. Give us the peace that only you can give, and give us the rest for our souls that only you can give. Let us rest in you. Let us be made whole in you. And let us be faithful and have obedient hearts all the days of our lives. Thank you for Jesus, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. Have a great week, guys.